Hello, thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this wonderful conference. I am, of course, very disappointed that the conference could not go ahead as planned in person, but I am very grateful to the organizers for allowing this to go ahead in a virtual forum. I am going to share with you my screen right now so that you can see my slides. And actually go back to the beginning. There we go. So what I want to talk about today is the topic of the Moravian memoirs, which, as some of you know, is a topic that has occupied me for most of my career. What I would like to do today is to talk about it from both a traditional perspective and then also through the lens of digital humanities. And so without further ado, I will get going. So the Moravian memoir presents to us a genre of life writing that seems to promise the record of an individual's life, an authentic record. The custom that was introduced by Zinzendorf in the 1750s as a means to bid farewell to the community was widely practiced in the American congregations of the 18th century. An examination of collections of memoirs, however, reveals telling differences between the various ethnic and cultural groups that made up colonial and American congregations, drawing on the North American corpora that were written in both English and German by European descended, African descended, and Native American congregation members. I will attempt to ask the question whether or not we can detect common patterns of recorded life experience. In what ways do these documents reveal fundamental differences in the self-professed motto of the Moravian Church, which forms part of the title of my paper? To what extent is the memoir an essential document of Moravian unity? Using both traditional and computational methods of reading, my talk draws on the digitized and manuscript collections of the Moravian archives in both Europe and North America, and which are also available through moravianlives.org. Since the mid-18th century, members of the Moravian Church, known in Germany as the Brüdergemeine or Unitas Fratrum, have written or dictated an account of their life to be read at their funeral. These memoirs total now over 65,000 and are housed primarily in archives in Herrnhut, Germany, and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in the US. But there also exist much smaller, less researched collections of documents in many of the Moravian settlements around the world. For example, the archives in Winston-Salem house approximately 3,000 memoirs. Additionally, less than 10% of the earliest manuscript material composed in the century between 1750 and 1850 has been published, and thus most of the memoirs remain inaccessible to researchers in the myriad fields to which they represent a potentially vital source of information. So here we can see a description of the significance of the memoir. First of all, we have this large corpus of autobiographical writings that cuts right across class, gender, historical, national, and cultural boundaries. We know why this particular genre was produced, the parameters for its composition. We can, with the use of tools such as those in digital humanities, have access to methods of collection, dissemination, and analysis that do provide us with the potential for significant reevaluations of historical constructions of race, gender, and sexuality. And we also are able to join a pretty lively discussion of the Moravian memoir, which has started really over the last 20 years. So over the last 20 years, the genre of the Moravian Lebenslauf or memoir has become the focus of increased academic interest in many different scholarly fields. This interest has been fueled by a more general recognition of autobiography as a genre worthy of scrutiny, and also by the easier physical access to the main repository of manuscript sources in the Unity archives in Herrnhut, Germany, that was, up until 30 years ago, the German Democratic Republic. Concurrent with this have been changes in conceptual models in social and religious history and gender and race theory that sees such ego documents as valuable primary sources to gain a perspective on social classes that do not normally have a voice in the writing of history. Voices of women, voices of men and women from the artisan classes, and also the voices of marginalized people who were enslaved or had been driven from their lands by settler colonists. A survey of recent publications in English and German reveals a healthy, vibrant, and multidimensional set of inquiries. One stable focus of the critical gaze within this genre has been the question of the freedom that was allowed each individual to express authentic and unique reflections on his or her own lived experience. Now, where some critics have argued that the very institutional edict to write a self-narration necessarily limits that act in terms of form, formulation, and individuality, others have argued that the pietistic environment in which these self-relations were created encouraged, at least in the 18th century, a balance between the demands of the community and the self. As Peter Faull has so aptly stated, the Moravian memoir constitutes, quote, a dynamic of reciprocity between individual witness and community identity, end of quotation. Paul Ekin also discusses such a reciprocity in the narration of the self and argues that without a story, there is no self. And in the age of the digital, this self is, quote, not only reported, but performed, certainly by any of us as we tell or write our stories of lives, and perhaps to a surprising degree by the rest of us as we listen to those stories or read them, end of quotation. So this dialectic, consisting of the demands of the individual and those of the community, is also evident in the Moravian motto that forms the first half of my talk today. The origin of the motto is thought to have come from the 16th century thinker Peter Meidelin, although it has also been wrongly attributed to Augustine of Hippo. Meidelin apparently adopted it from an earlier Catholic bishop, Mark Antonio de Dominis, 1560 to 1624, who was embroiled in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation and subsequently left the Catholic Church. Thus, it is a motto that is not exclusive to the Moravian Church, but rather is entwined in the confessional and denominational conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries. According to Craig Atwood, it is a motto that is also used by other religious groups, such as the Quakers and Evangelical Presbyterians. It is therefore clearly not a motto that 18th century Moravians would have known or recognized, either in the US or in Europe. Considered an attempt to transcend sectarian differences, this dictum, again according to Atwood, was first cited in a Moravian context by Augustus Schulze, a professor at the Moravian Theological Seminary in 1902, and was then quickly adopted by American Moravians, perhaps because of its obvious echoes of the language and intent of the foundational documents of the United States. Despite the external origin, this motto does serve as a useful summary of the ethics of the Moravian Church in America, perhaps a Moravian a pluribus unum. Mottos serve as an externally and internally directed signifier. To outsiders of a group, they signal important beliefs held by the insiders. To the insiders, they act as a reminder of the way in which one should live. They act as a sort of shorthand to group identity and a glue that keeps that group together. When trying to understand the identity and cohesion of the Moravian Church, the theoretical framework that has been most utilized over the last 20 years is that of Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities. For example, in her foundational study of the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeine as a global community, Gisela Metteler in 2009 employed Anderson's concept of the necessity of simultaneity and communication, which is of course highly appropriate for today's Zoom environments, coupled with the importance of language to construct an intellectually satisfying picture of the Moravian Church as an entity that would thrive in the realization of its motto, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things love. Similarly, Peter Vogt, in his essay Everywhere at Home in 2006, outlines the pillars on which the transatlantic Moravian Church founded its work. For Vogt, these consist in 1, strong leadership, 2, an effective network of communication, and 3, a uniform system of belief and worship. Vogt's essay clearly outlines those aspects that he considers most important for such unity in belief and worship. If we think of one of the unifying forces of the Moravian Church, we might immediately think of the terminology that the Moravians use. How many of us, Moravian scholars, have had to include a glossary of terms in any monograph or edition of Moravian materials? What to Moravians and non-Moravians who've immersed themselves in this history may not need explanation is quite baffling to outsiders. What is a love feast, a choir, a Singstunde, a Pedilavium, a sick waiter? This specialized terminology, which exists in German, English, and any of the other languages of the people of the Church, provides, as Vogt argues, the connectedness between the members of the community in terms of fraternal kinship ties. It is a kinship based not on blood ties, but on a shared vocabulary of belief. Vogt argues that the very concept of the Gemeine or congregation implies the awareness and concrete experience of being connected to fellow believers. I'm going to just reappear here. The organization of the Moravian Church was first held together, argues Vogt, by the charismatic personality of its founder, Count Zinzendorf, and after his death, the Unity Elders Conference, who saw to the organization of the Gemeine as providing a strong and universally recognizable structure within which members could continue to feel connected globally. This homogeneity, as Vogt calls it, was also present in the unity of worship and faith. The Singstunde in Salem should be the same as the Singstunde in Herrnhut, or Neu-Herrnhut in Greenland or Australia, or the singing hour in Fulneck, Yorkshire. Coupled with this uniformity of ritual structure is the fact of its communication to all other places in the Moravian world through the Gemeinnachrichten, or its successor publications. Extracts from mission reports, memoirs deemed of universal interest, diaries, letters, etc. were sent out to the Moravian congregations around the globe. These same reports were read out loud to the congregations, if not completely simultaneously to the hour, but at least on the same Sunday at the monthly Gemeintag. In this way, Onondaga and Lenape people in central Pennsylvania could hear about the mission to the Inuit in Greenland. A young Friedrich Schleiermacher in Barbie could learn about Heckewelder's travels through Ohio and up to Detroit. And Anna Rosina Anders in Bethlehem could hear about the life of the child Peter West, born in London in 1751 and buried in Fulneck in 1760, in the very Gottesacker where Anna herself would be buried in 1803. This unifying ritualistic action of writing, reading, and listening to the lives and actions of others provides, according to Vogt and Metteler, the stability and unifying strength of the expanding Moravian Church across the globe. Am I recording? But what about that other tenet of Moravian motto in non-essentials liberty? Sorry about that. But what about that other tenet of the Moravian motto, in non-essentials liberty? What are such non-essentials, and how did liberty manifest itself in the lives of the Moravians? To return to the 18th century, in the light of the origins of this motto, it is clear that the notion of essentials as outlined by Faull and Mettler can be agreed upon. But in an era prior to the political revolutions of the late 18th century, we must remember that liberty, or libertas, Freiheit, freedom, occurred in more of a confessional sense than in a political one. So how might this motto apply to the memoirs from this early period? Critics such as Gisela Mettler, again, Stefanie Börs, Christine Loost, and myself have argued for the importance of the Moravian memoir as a social and theological practice within the church. Mettler's examination of the memoirs that was circulated as the part of the Gemeinnachrichten argues for the importance of the uniformity of the published lives to show, quote, simultus justus et peccator, end of quote, a publicly communicated salvific history of the individual as sinner and redeemed. Thus, the individual differences in terms of details of where someone was born, into which social class, what language someone spoke, could all be considered to be inessential, right? To be insignificant in comparison with the essential consciousness of the individual's need for salvation. Now, I think that this last point is particularly bewildering to those of us in the 21st century when we read autobiographical documents by enslaved peoples or those whose lands had been occupied by settler colonists. The commonality with white Moravians consists in a slavery to sin and not in physical bondage, not in the question of being enslaved or dispossessed or colonized. So within the language and symbology of the Moravian Church, maybe there is a place where some form of liberty is exercised. I agree with Faull about the role of ritual in the cementing of far-flung communities together. However, as we have seen from recent work by Rachel Wheeler and Sarah Irely, Moravian hymns are still expressions of faith, whether they are sung in Mohican, Delaware, German, or English. But when it comes to the composition of a memoir, is there perhaps inherent within that very act a tension between the individual life and the universal pattern of salvation? The required record of Moravian's both outer and inner journey was first read at the funeral love feast, and then copies of those memoirs were sent to a central archive in Helmhout, from where they could be disseminated to Moravian congregations around the world. The memoirs of leaders and role models, male and female, nobility, or from the artisan classes, European or African or American, were first reproduced by hand and then in print and circulated in these accounts. Because of the worldwide reach of the Moravian Church, the archives preserve some of the earliest ego documents produced by 18th century Africans and Native Americans. And archiving these documents has fulfilled a twofold purpose. That is, storing and ordering them in the institutional archival memory of the Moravian Church. And also, for those who have access to this archival memory, they serve as a locus of presence and interactivity in what we would call lived memory. As noted above, the relation of the lives of exemplary believers has helped to create, quote, a tangible impression of the invisible church community, from Peter Faull. In an examination of several centuries worth of memoirs from the Helmhout archives, the critic Christina Loost has described the communicative structure of Moravian experience. Like the genre of autobiography, Moravian memoir is both inwardly and outwardly directed. That is, it serves, excuse me, it serves as a means for self-examination of several centuries. Sorry, let's try that again. Like the genre of autobiography, the Moravian memoir is both inwardly and outwardly directed. It serves as a means of self-examination for the writing I, as well as simultaneously participating in the construction of a communal identity. This dialectic of individual and community that so influenced Friedrich Schleiermacher's concept of religious consciousness and ethical action reflects very much Zinzendorf's own understanding of the function of the memoir. The relation of one's life within the community serves as an act of witness and testimony to the invisible host of those who had gone before, and indeed those who were still to come. Lewis discusses the various means implemented in the community to bring its members into fellowship with their peers. Multiple opportunities existed to record and hear such autobiographical reflections, whether in letters, memoirs, or diaries. And according to Lewis, these oral and written forms of communication came together with gender-specific construction of the community through the choir system, and thus underscored a Moravian notion that the human being is not divided into realms of mind, body, and spirit, but rather constitutes an interrelated, holistic entity. Within the context of scholarship on the Moravian memoir, this notion of an instantiation of selfhood stands in a powerful relationship with the formulation of what the founder of the church, Zinzendorf, called the invisible or universal Gemeine, or congregation. If we bring into this concept of the universal congregation concepts of cultural and personal memory, following the critical work of German Jan Assmann, we might also ask how in writing one's memoir, one can balance such demands of personal desire to belong to a social group with the lived realities of one's own life. We may need to ask, to what extent can there be liberty? What might it look like? And what role does this balancing act play in creating a universal history of the church as Zinzendorf envisaged it? What happens when the authors of those self-relations belong to otherwise disenfranchised groups within the 18th century, groups such as the enslaved peoples of Africa, the freed and formerly enslaved, the Christianized indigenous peoples from the Moravian mission movement, and also women? In what way can the Moravian memoir act as an authentic relation of the self and not instead represent the acquisition of a new language, a new argot that would signal membership within this particular group? In order to be able to answer some of these thorny questions, we must first be able to create a corpus of documents. This is where my digital hat goes on, in a form that can be computationally or humanly read at a large scale. The extraordinarily large number of memoirs in the worldwide archives of the Moravian Church presents both opportunities and challenges for researchers who wish to draw on this corpus and who wish to access the archival memory for the purposes of lived memory. How can we read so many documents? Not just in terms of their numbers, but also because they're in different languages, they're in German script, and then when they're printed, they're in Fraktur. What patterns might we identify that could reveal differences in style, voice, and lexicon? How can this access to such a wide-ranging corpus be a radical force in changing the way in which we think about the colonial period, for example, and also who writes in the colonial period? Accessibility to these documents has severely curtailed the ability of researchers to conduct comparative analyses between time periods, place of composition, ethnicity, and gender. However, with access to such a large corpus of ego documents that span social class, race, and gender, scholars in many fields can begin to ask and attempt to answer these major thorny research questions about identity, selfhood, and writing. From within the field of religious history and autobiography, a number of questions have still not been satisfactorily answered. For example, is there a distinctive women's voice that can be heard in the memoirs that is not subordinated to a male voice? is there an identifiable pattern of secularization in the 19th century, as was, for example, argued by Beverly Smaby in her work from over 30 years ago? How do individuals conceive of their own death and the death of others through time? What kinds of lives did women and other marginalized peoples live within the Moravian Church, and how did those lives change? The development of tools in the field of digital humanities affords researchers a way of not only approaching these questions, but also thinking in new ways about how to conceptualize notions of self, narrative, and language. Not only the construction of social network diagrams, but also the building of semantic maps is possible with digital corpora of Moravian memoirs. And such corpora already exist. Many scholars, as they are putting together the work that they need for their scholarly publications, have constructed corpora of memoirs. The development of digital tools and text analysis, such as Voyant and LIWC, which we'll see later on, permit the investigation of large text corpora in search of keywords, lexical keyness, most frequently used words, etc. Looking for meaningful patterns in the exercise of distant reading transforms digital tools into integral parts of the process of understanding the history of Christianity. Furthermore, we can do things like tag texts with names and places and organizations, and from those marked texts, we can build up networks and geospatial analyses, and thereby allow this work to expand our horizons and find new answers to old questions. In many ways, reenacting the archival drive of the Moravians in the 18th century, namely their desire to keep a record of the activities and lives of the members of the church for the purpose of creating a history from below, the methods of DH, digital humanities, permit analyses of both metadata and text on the large amounts of information. And that allows the other function of memoir to also perhaps be fulfilled, the function of lived memory, in which the archive materials of the past become present again and interact with us today. The Moravian Lives Project, initiated in 2014 and centered at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, and initially at Gothenburg University in Sweden, is aimed at precisely such an access, namely through the construction of a searchable database of the memoir metadata of all the holdings in the main archives of the Moravian Church in Bethlehem and Herrnhut, Germany, of memoirs. We can also link these visualizations with the facsimile and transcribed memoirs and their extracted entities. So here is an example of what I just said in that terribly long sentence. So if you go to moravianlives.org, and actually the interface to use that's slightly faster now is a mirror site that we created at Bucknell, which is moravian.bucknell.edu. Just by using the map interface, you can construct some interesting visualizations from just the birth and death data of people about their movements. Here, for example, what we've done is I've typed in, as you can see, Salem here into the place search engine. And this accesses the MySQL database of the metadata from Herrnhut and Bethlehem. And then you can ask to search, and you get this interesting map. And what this map is showing, excuse me, what this map is showing is a record of the movements through birth and death places. So not talking about where these people went when they were alive, but just their birth and death places of any record that mentions Salem. So just by doing this, by searching for Salem as either a birthplace or a death place, we can quickly visualize the global reach of Salem itself. What we can then do after we've done this is to take a look at the records This is just a snapshot of the 1,758 records that include Salem in the database. If the place of death is listed as Salem, as you can see over on this side, although this is a mistake, and unfortunately some of the records do have mistakes in them, need to be corrected, then there's a very good chance that the memoir of this particular person is in the Salem archive. And then a copy was sent on to Herrnhut. Now you may also notice here we have this record, right? A Neger born in Guinea, which was the 18th century designation, basically the whole of West Africa. And then this person died in Salem in 1797. So what we can do next is to click on that particular record. And what is brought up then is a nice little map view there, and more information about this particular person. So that even though this person is not given a name within the record here, we can see down here when we look at the memoir reference that actually this person does have a name, and that is Abraham, and he was also called Sambo. His memoir is long. It is 10 pages long, which is very long for a memoir. And we can see exactly where that memoir was published in the Gemeinde-Nachrichten. Now, unfortunately, we have not yet digitized the Gemeinde-Nachrichten for those years. It's something which I'm hoping very much will happen soon. And then when those records are digitized, they can be linked then from here, so that you could then click on that particular document reference and it would take you to an image of the original document. So although we haven't done that for the Gemeinde-Nachrichten, we have done that for all of the memoirs in Bethlehem that have already been digitized. So you might remember that on the slide when I was talking about the memoir, I had those two images of Peter and Mary Titus's memoirs. So here is the record for Mary Titus. And here we can see she died in Bethlehem. And then through this icon here, we can see that she does have a record available. If we click on that, we are taken then to the transcription desk, where we can see an image of the original document. There is a transcription that's already been done. And then here is the text of the transcription. We also have people checking it because citizen scientists are not always experts in paleography. So therefore, but even so, we have access then to a digital text. If we search for her husband, Peter, then we also find his memoir on the transcription desk, and it has already been transcribed. This memoir reveals that he was born in New York City. His mother was Rebecca, his father remains unnamed, but he was one of the best musicians in New York City of the time who performed regularly every night. That's a great story there. Peter is born in the house of Christian Fröhlich, as we see here, who was a Moravian itinerant preacher whose major area of focus in the 1740s was visiting the plantations in both the north, in New Jersey and New York, that used the enslaved labor of Africans to make iron. Fröhlich also visited the tobacco plantations of Virginia, where the labor of enslaved people created the wealth of the plantation owners and also the state of Virginia. Fröhlich's travel journals from the Bethlehem archives that have actually all been digitized reveal that on some of his preaching trips in the north, Fröhlich took as his assistant Andrew, who was a young Igbo man who had been enslaved in West Africa and brought via Antigua to New York City. He took him along as an assistant on those trips. I have written at great length about Andrew in various of my publications. And Andrew was the first African male to be baptized in Bethlehem in the presence of Bishop Spangenberg. Here is his memoir. I wrote at length and published Andrew's life story about 20 years ago, but only recently have I been able to discover far more about his activities in the years that followed his dictation, the dictation of this memoir. Through going through the Bethlehem Diary, which is now completely digitized, I have been able to discern that prior to his marriage with another enslaved African, Magdalena, who we will come to next, he was very active in working with Christian Fröhlich on his preaching trips to the ironworks of New Jersey and New York. Then after this, he went on preaching trips with him to Philadelphia and later alone, which is really quite remarkable, to talk to the people of his nation, as the Bethlehem Diary puts it. It is also clear from the Bethlehem Diary that Andrew wanted to leave the Moravians and Bethlehem to live with and work among the Igbo of Philadelphia. And in order to avoid him leaving, the Aufseherkollegium in Bethlehem found him and his intended wife, Magdalena, a place to live and gave them permission to marry. In my earlier work on the rhetoric employed by Andrew and Magdalena, I tried to make it clear that the tropes, phrases, and vocabulary employed in their memoirs very much adheres to and plays with the expectations of a predominantly white audience who would be reading their memoir. To use a concept from Henry Louis Gates, both Andrew and Magdalena knew how to signify. Much work has to be done on the topic of what I have termed Black Bethlehem, but we have been able to digitize the memoirs I have located so far in the location on the Moravian Lives transcription desk. Being able to make collections of memoirs allows us to create corpora or bodies of text. And this is what I'd like to turn to next, to discuss what we do then with such corpora. In a paper that I presented with my doctoral student, Michael Maguire, at a conference in Halle a couple of years ago, he and I constructed a corpus of transcribed memoirs written by men and women in two different congregations, namely in Bethlehem and also in the Fetter Lane archive in London. The files were scraped from the transcription desk, cleaned and saved to plain text files to make them easy to analyze. The selection criteria were that these memoirs should for the most part be in the first person from the 8th and also from the 18th century. Also included in the corpus are two first-person memoirs from African and African-American men, Peter and Andrew, and one by Magdalena, two memoirs also by Native Americans. And here's just the very boring database of the memoirs that we used. Here's a description of the corpus. As you can see, it's a small corpus, only 48 memoirs, but we can see the variety of places from which the authors of the memoirs came. And then we can also see the numbers of men and women as well. Here is the breakdown, again, by numbers of the memoirs. And then, so these are here are the memoirs, and then here are what we call the word tokens, so that once we have performed what's called lemmatization, we can look at just the stems of words. So this is making it easier for the computer to actually read the memoirs. Having created the corpus, we perform what is known as distant reading or computational analysis and attempt to describe and analyze the pattern of normative expressions. However, as Jacqueline van Gent, another Moravian critic, has argued, in the context of Moravian ego documents, the expression of the speaking subject in a textual source does not necessarily allow the reader to know what it was that the speaking subject was feeling, what kind of emotions they might be interested in. And that's something that Michael and I were particularly interested in, is this emotion of the speaker, and try to perform sentiment analysis. Gent argues, rather salient emotions reported in these sources adhere to the language rules and expectations of a linguistic and emotional community. In the same way as I argued in the context of writing about African memoirs with Andrew and Magdalena, converted non-European people adopt the emotional vocabulary of the Moravians in order to display their membership in that particular group. We know this as code switching. The question as to the authenticity of emotions that are expressed is a much harder one to answer. We do not know whether this is real just by looking at and valorizing the emotions that are contained within the memoirs. However, as mentioned above, one part of the unity of the Moravian motto, the norms of Moravian language, adhere to expectations for norms that are set throughout specific praxes within the Moravian Church. So we can, once we've created a corpus, ask questions like, what do the memoirs reveal about terms like liberty, unity, and love? Are there differences between men's and women's memoirs? Do Native Americans and African Americans seem to emote differently from European Moravians? And does the language of expression affect in any way this expression of emotion? And so here is just some very quick analyses. So this is an example of the kinds of tools that we use. This is called the links visualization tool from the Voyant platform. And this was then we added then here basically what is a concordancing tool called AntConc, which looks for the use of terms in context. So running the Bethlehem and Faull men's memoirs through Voyant, and this is just looking for most frequent words, we can see that in English, for the memoirs from Faull, Yorkshire, the most frequent word is time, heart, and saviour. And then from Bethlehem is heart, saviour, year. So really very little difference between the two. We can dig deeper into them and see what kinds of other words are key. And you can do that with AntConc. And really there was very little difference in distinctive word usage between the two sets of memoirs. For the women, we see also there is very little difference. For the Faull memoirs, we see the most frequent words are time, heart, saviour, again. And for the Bethlehem women, heart, saviour, Lord. So time has sort of become subsumed in there a little bit. And then looking at the key terms of the Moravian motto in this memoir, what do we find? And this is just the results of running this through that. So unity is referred to only in terms of speaking about the unity of the brethren. Again, liberty is really talked about only in the context of having been freed from prison, literally prison. And as we know from the early Moravian church, quite a few of the early Moravians were imprisoned for their belief. And so that's when liberty comes up. Love is a different question though. So really, as the motto says, in all things love, that is true. The word love appears a great deal in the corpus, predominantly in the men's memoirs in the context of Christ's love, and for the women, additionally, in the context of familial love. And I found that very interesting, and maybe because of the presence of married women's memoirs in there, they're also talking about love as well. Here are a couple of visualizations of the terms that appear with love, and the asterisk means that the word has been lemmatized. So this is the root form. So it could be loved, lover, etc. That would be included in here. And here are the terms that are connected to that particular term in the memoirs. And then unity over here, again, you can see this is very much in terms of like a synod or the unity of the brethren. Over here in this rather charming bubble diagram, again, we have a visualization of the linked terms with the concept of love. So if we try to do the same kind of thing with Andrew and Titus's memoirs, we actually end up with a really strikingly different result. Now, first of all, obviously, Andrew and Titus are writing in German, so the terms are going to look very different. Excuse me a minute. But what we find in most frequent words for their memoirs, we have Zeit, time, again, Jahr, year, again, we're talking about in this year, which is to be expected, right, if you're talking about a chronicle of your life. But here we also have the name of the owner of Andrew. So Mr. Noble, and then in Peter's memoir, we have Meister, master. Those two terms appear far more frequently than the term Heiland. Liebe, love, is used only as an attributive adjective. It is never used as a noun. Freedom and unity do not appear in either memoir. So if there are limits to, if we're talking about code switching, if we're talking about limits to authenticity of expression within marginalized groups, then perhaps that we can find another method to try to dig deeper into the unconscious states of the people who are writing these memoirs. And there is a very useful tool that I use in my classes on text analysis called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, created by the psychologist James Pennebaker. And his methodology is very different to the methodology of Voyant, because he does not depend on what we call content words like nouns and verbs and adjectives, but rather on function words or stop words. Now, these are the words that are very often removed from text when they're analyzed. These function words are boring words. They're words like articles, prepositions, pronouns, negations, auxiliary verbs, conjunctions, quantifiers, etc. So let's go back to English here. These are all parts of speech that we actually use unconsciously, and we use them a lot. They're very short and very hard to detect when you're listening, but they're also processed in a different part of the brain than content words like nouns and verbs. They are also very social. Pronouns, of course, are referring to people, and therefore they're always talking about the way in which we view other people and perhaps also ourselves. So can using this method overcome the problems that I outlined above with other computational methods in the analysis of Moravian memoirs? Can we access maybe a more subconscious psychological state of the author, excuse me, through using Pennebaker's methods? So this is what I tried to find, and this is the way we have a quick summary here. His argument is that when we are happy, we use we words more often. When we're sad, we tend to use personal pronoun I more often. When we're happy, we use more concrete nouns for times and places. When we're sad or depressed, we tend to use the past tense and the future tense more, and the present tense less. When we're angry, we tend to use second person focused pronouns and think in the present, what are you doing, etc. And those who have experienced trauma tend to use I words far less and have a very low rate of negative emotion words. Language is far simpler, the sentences are shorter, and there are very few cognitive words that are contained within that particular expression. Intense grief causes a person to turn away from themselves and focus on those who have died. So what happens if we run the corpora through LIWC? So just quick summary here. The women who write in German from the Bethlehem archive those memoirs show a significant difference between white American and Native American women in terms of positive emotion. The negative emotion measure, however, which signals anxiety, sadness, and hostility, doesn't show much variance. maybe the absence of positive emotion does not necessarily mean that there is a presence of negative emotion. Of the women's memoirs from Bethlehem that are in English, we find far more variation in the authenticity measure. Of the men from the Bethlehem archive who write in German, the lowest positive emotion score in the corpus is with Andrew. It's very interesting. However, one of the highest positive emotion scores belongs to Peter Titus. Andrew's memoir scores among the highest for negative emotion also. Of the men in Bethlehem who write in English, there is hardly any variation in positive or negative emotion scores. And similarly, among the men from the English archives as well, there is very little variation between either positive or negative emotion. From the women from Fetter Lane archive in London who write in English, we do have quite a range in both authenticity and positive emotion, and also in emotional tone. So obviously, these scores do not define the last word on an author's state of mind, but they are an interesting way in which we can examine whether memoirs are all uniform in their expression of the relation of a life. I just want to quickly show this wonderful graph that my doctoral student Michael has put together, and we are publishing in our essay on analyzing Moravian emotions. And this graph shows that there is a variation between men and women, and also in terms of place, in terms of emotions within the memoirs. And so this axis here is showing us that these are the negative emotion up to positive emotion. And this axis here is showing us narrative time. So for Fetter Lane women, they start out quite sad, get sadder, get happy, get sad again, and then get happy to quite a distinct degree. Interestingly enough, Bethlehem women do not show more than one peak, a slight peak at the end. Bethlehem men also show a double peak like the Fetter Lane women, and the Fetter Lane men show quite a trough, quite a rise, and then a little downward spiral, and then back up again. But obviously this is, the methodology will be outlined in the paper that will be published. But it is quite fascinating to think that we can actually quantify these emotional expressions within different memoir corpora. So I'm nearly done. Drawing on a collection of memoirs that's been compiled by my colleague Scott Gordon for one of his courses at Lehigh, I would just like to finish up here to talk about Native American emotions. So some of these memoirs have already been published. Some are only in manuscript form. It's a small corpus of only 12 memoirs by or about Native Americans and 10 by or about African descended peoples. What would the scores for emotion look for these memoirs? And these are very different from the memoirs from London and Bethlehem. We know such texts are very difficult to find. Often biographical information is hidden behind Europeanized names or racialized monikers. And of this corpus, this particular corpus of 22, 20 are written in the third person and only 2 in the first person. However, even within the third person memoirs, we can find direct quotations from the speaking or interviewed subject. Running the text through Luke, through the linguistic inquiry and word count algorithms, we can find that among the Native American authors, the highest score for anger and negative emotion is found in this memoir, Michael's, which is actually published and translated on the the Bethlehem Digital History Project. Michael, and we do not have a record of his native name, came from the Minnesink people and was baptized in Chicomico by Brother Bucknell. He was described as a great warrior. His bravery was written on his face in a series of tattoos, his own sort of tattoo Lebenslauf in many ways. And these tattoos consisted of a snake, scalps on a pole, 2 cross spears, and a boar. The choir helper of the Single Brethren, who recorded his memoir, writes, "All of this was done very neatly." The choir helper continues, "In bands, Michael was always very open-hearted and upright, and if something came his way to disturb his blessed progress, he called it by its name and said, quote, 'Brothers, now you have it there, the evil spirit that wants to deceive me,' end of quote." According to the text, Michael refuses to consider the proposed relocation of Christianized native people to the Wyoming Valley. And during the French and Indian War, he bolstered up the spirits of the Single Brethren who kept watch on the barricades of Bethlehem and urged them not to be afraid of the French Indians, but rather says, quote, "If you are in good stead with the Savior, you would not be so nervous. Your bad hearts are responsible for your anxiety," end of quote. Michael is considered, quote, "the crown of all our baptized in this part of the world, because his holiness progressed after his baptism without many changes and transformations," end of quote. So perhaps we need to ask ourselves, where does the negative emotion and anger come from that reveals itself in the use of function words in Michael's memoir? Maybe it resides in his resistance to being moved away from Bethlehem, maybe his bravery, maybe his choice to become Christianized. Or we could look at Isaac, a young Mohican Wampanoag man who died at the age of 18, having been baptized at the age of 11. His memoir scores very, very low for authenticity. Why? It's strange. His mother and father had been baptized by Moravians. By 14, he had lost both of them to smallpox and fever and was taken in by friends who moved with him first to the Wyoming Valley and then to the Moravian mission of Gnadenhutten. He escaped to Bethlehem after the attack on the mission in November of 1755 and was taken into the Single Brethren's house, where he died the following year of consumption. On his deathbed, the choir helper notes, quote, "At his request, a number of little hymn verses in Indian were sung to him by the Indians present. Shortly before his departure, Brother Schmick asked him if he felt Jesus' blood in his heart and would gladly go home, to which he replied, Kwame, that is, yes. After that, he stretched himself out, laid his hands on his breast, and went to sleep for a while," end of quote. What I find so interesting in this description is that the language in which the verses are sung and his last words are recorded in his own tongue. Is this the cause for inauthenticity? Such distant reading and linguistic analysis opens up an intriguing window into the language of feelings of past authors. But in some cases, we also need to question how much of these reflect true feelings versus a reflection of social, cultural, and community expectations. And this is particularly true of marginalized groups in situations where there is a power imbalance. Written memoirs could represent a form of code switching. Dialect and speech act as a form of identity expression and gender expression. And the degree to which this is true depends on the social situation. People are much less likely to use non-standard speech or express a marginalized identity, usually where there is a power imbalance, for example, in a keynote lecture such as this. A memoir could be one of those cases where emotional and language expression is aligned more with social norms rather than internal identity for certain groups of people, and that might explain the low authenticity scores. If we return to the initial question that was posed at the beginning of this lecture, namely, what is the nature of the practice of unity and liberty within the Moravian Church of the 18th century? Can we perhaps test those claims by examining the recorded lives of those who belong to non-European groups, especially the women? I've tried to show in this lecture first the main ways in which scholars have tried to understand the praxis of the creation of unity within the Moravian Church of the 18th century through neologisms, specific linguistic tropes, ritual, and simultaneous communication. Then I examined one of the main means to create unity, that is the writing of a memoir that definitely follows a specific narrative and emotional pattern which is composed to be read to others. Beyond reading individual memoirs out of primarily genealogical interest or for the subject's perceived exemplary significance to the movement, studying the large corpus of Moravian memoirs is only possible if we have access to them. 30 memoirs by Moravian women that I translated and published over 20 years ago are still selling, and recently a fellow Moravian scholar casually noted, "Oh, who doesn't use that in their courses?" But those are only 30 memoirs. The Moravian Lives digital project aims to make available through the publishing of original archival documents and their transcriptions thousands more memoirs. By creating these digital texts, we are able to make the sources available to scholars to test the claims of universality, liberty, unity, and love. We make available the lives of those whose very chances at liberty or life at the birth of the United States was not guaranteed, and who are indeed still fighting to become American. Thank you.